In 1902, a machine meant to control humidity accidentally gave humanity something far stranger: control over their nightmares. Within a decade, dream researchers noticed a chilling pattern. People sleeping in cooled rooms reported identical recurring dreams about frozen monarchs and crystalline prisons. This is the story of how we traded natural sleep for manufactured rest, and what we lost in our dreams along the way. If you're fascinated by the hidden costs of technological progress and the mysteries of human consciousness, subscribe now, because the history of sleep technology gets even stranger than this. In the sweltering summer of 1902, in a printing plant in Brooklyn, New York, a young engineer named Willis Carrier stood before a problem that had nothing to do with human comfort and everything to do with ink and paper. The Sackett, Wilhelm's lithographing and publishing company, was losing thousands of dollars because the humidity in their facility kept changing, causing the paper to expand and contract at unpredictable rates. When you're trying to print in color, when you're trying to layer one hue precisely over another, even the slightest shift in the paper's dimensions can turn a masterpiece into a blurred, worthless mess. The owners were desperate. They'd tried everything conventional wisdom suggested, and nothing worked. So they called in this ambitious 25-year-old engineer from the Buffalo Forge Company, hoping he might see what others had missed. Carrier arrived with notebooks and measuring instruments, and he did what good engineers do. He observed, he calculated, he measured everything. He tracked the temperature. He tracked the humidity. He noted how the paper behaved at different times of day, in different seasons, under different atmospheric conditions. And slowly, methodically, an idea began to form in his mind. What if you could control the moisture in the air itself? What if you could create an artificial climate inside a building, regardless of what the weather was doing outside? It wasn't a new dream. People had been trying to cool buildings for centuries, using everything from ice blocks to elaborate fan systems. But Carrier approached it differently. He wasn't interested in simply making people feel cooler. He wanted to control humidity with precision, to create specific atmospheric conditions that could be maintained consistently, day after day, hour after hour. The system he designed passed air over coils, chilled with cold water, causing the moisture to condense out of the air before it entered the printing facility. The air that emerged was not just cooler but drier, with precisely the humidity level that would keep the paper stable. When they installed the system and fired it up for the first time, the results were immediate and remarkable. The paper stopped expanding and contracting. The color registrations became consistent. The printing quality improved dramatically. The company was thrilled. They'd solved their production problem. But what nobody realized at the time, what nobody could have predicted, was that Willis Carrier had accidentally created a technology that would fundamentally alter one of humanity's most ancient and universal experiences: sleep. The printing plant ran around the clock, and some of the workers had sleeping quarters nearby, simple rooms where they could rest between shifts. These rooms, by proximity and by experimental curiosity, were among the first living spaces in human history to be artificially cooled and dehumidified on a consistent basis. The workers who slept there noticed the comfort immediately. No more lying awake in sticky summer heat, no more waking up drenched in sweat. The cooled air was a blessing, a luxury that made the brutal schedule of industrial work just slightly more bearable. But they began noticing something else too, something they couldn't quite articulate at first. Their sleep felt different, deeper perhaps, more continuous, and their dreams had changed. For millions of years, human beings had slept in environments where temperature fluctuated naturally. When our ancestors huddled in caves or simple shelters, they felt the temperature drop as night deepened, felt it rise again as dawn approached. Their bodies evolved to expect these changes, to incorporate them into the complex orchestration of sleep stages and dream cycles. The cooling that occurs naturally in the hours before dawn triggers specific hormonal responses. It affects the depth of REM sleep, the vividness of dreams, the ease of waking, for all of human history until this moment in 1902. Every single person who had ever lived had slept in an environment where temperature changed throughout the night, according to natural patterns that were ancient and predictable. But now, for the first time, people were sleeping in rooms where the temperature remained constant. Hour after hour, through the entire night, the air around them stayed exactly the same. Their bodies didn't know what to make of it. The deep biological programming that expected temperature fluctuation kept waiting for signals that never came. And something in the architecture of their sleep began to shift in response. The workers didn't think much of it at first. Dreams are strange anyway, aren't they? We've all had odd dreams, dreams that seem to come from nowhere, dreams whose imagery makes no sense in the light of day. But as weeks passed, as the summer heat persisted outside while the sleeping rooms remained cool and dry inside, the workers began comparing notes. They started mentioning their dreams to each other during breaks, casually at first, then with growing curiosity. Because they were having similar dreams, not identical, but thematically related in ways that seemed too consistent to be coincidence. Dreams about cold, dreams about ice, dreams about vast frozen landscapes and crystalline structures, and dreams about kings, frozen kings, ice kings, monarchs entombed in frost. Nobody thought to document this systematically. These were working men at a printing plant, not scientists conducting a study. The dreams were just an oddity, a strange side effect of sleeping in the miraculously cooled rooms. Some of them liked the dreams. Others found them unsettling. But life moved on, and the dreams became just another part of the experience of working at the plant, like the smell of ink, or the rhythmic thunder of the printing presses. Meanwhile, Willis Carrier was becoming something of a celebrity in engineering circles. His system worked beautifully, and word spread quickly through industries that had similar problems. Textile mills, pharmaceutical manufacturers, any business that needed precise climate control began installing versions of his apparatus. The Buffalo Forge Company was thrilled with their young engineer's success. They started manufacturing and selling cooling systems as a major part of their business. Carrier himself continued refining the technology, making it more efficient, more reliable, more affordable. But here's what's fascinating: it took almost a decade before anyone connected the cooling systems with sleep changes. Carrier certainly didn't think about it. He was focused on industrial applications, on solving problems for factories and plants. The few installations in residential spaces were luxury items for the wealthy, and the wealthy weren't comparing notes about their dreams with factory workers in Brooklyn. The cooling system spread across the country, across industries, and everywhere they went, they created these little islands of controlled climate. These unprecedented environments where temperature remained constant through the night. In Boston, a textile mill installed one of the systems in 1905. Some of the supervisors lived in apartments above the factory floor, and those apartments were cooled by the excess capacity of the industrial system. In Chicago, a pharmaceutical company installed cooling in their production facility and their administrative offices in 1907. In Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in cities across the industrial Northeast, these systems multiplied. And in all these places, in sleeping spaces touched by this new technology, people began dreaming differently. It wasn't until around 1910 that the first scientific observations began to emerge. A neurologist in Boston named Dr. Harrison Pembroke had treated several patients who worked at the textile mill with the cooling system. They'd come to him with complaints about insomnia, about feeling unrested despite sleeping through the night, about strange and vivid dreams. Pembroke was intrigued enough to start asking questions. He discovered that these patients all worked at the same facility, all lived in the cooled apartments. He began keeping notes on their dream reports, And he noticed patterns, the same patterns the printing plant workers had noticed years earlier. Cold imagery, ice frozen figures, crystalline structures. Pembroke was cautious. He knew how easy it is to see patterns that aren't really there, especially when dealing with something as subjective as dreams. But he was thorough. He started asking other patients about their sleeping environments and their dreams, creating a kind of informal control group. And the difference was striking. Patients who slept in naturally ventilated rooms where the temperature varied through the night, reported dreams that were more varied, more chaotic, more tied to their daily experiences. But patients who slept in cooled rooms consistently reported these cold, crystalline, frozen dreams. He published a paper about it in a small medical journal in 1911. The paper was cautious, careful not to claim too much. He simply documented what he'd observed and suggested that artificial cooling might affect sleep architecture in ways that warranted further study. The paper was largely ignored. Most physicians didn't have any patients sleeping in cooled rooms, so the phenomenon seemed irrelevant to their practice. The few responses Pembroke received were skeptical. Dreams are too variable, too personal, too influenced by individual psychology to show consistent environmental effects, the critics said. But Pembroke wasn't the only one noticing. In New York, a psychologist named Dr. Miriam Ashford was working with dream diaries, having her patients record their dreams immediately upon waking. It was cutting-edge research for the time, part of the early wave of scientific interest in dream analysis and unconscious mental processes. One of her patients was a wealthy industrialist who had just installed one of Carrier's cooling systems in his townhouse. Within a week of sleeping in the cooled bedroom, his dream diary changed dramatically. The man was a meticulous record keeper, and his dreams before the installation had been full of business anxieties, social situations, memories from his past. But after the cooling system was installed, ice crept into his dreams. Not subtly, not gradually, but immediately and persistently. He dreamed of walking through frozen palaces. He dreamed of kings trapped in glaciers. He dreamed of standing in vast halls made entirely of ice, with frozen thrones and crystalline chandeliers. Ashford was scientific enough to suspect a connection, but careful enough to wait for more data. She started asking other patients about their sleeping environments, and she found more examples. Not many cooled sleeping spaces were still rare in 1911, but the pattern held. When people slept in artificially cooled rooms, their dreams took on these frozen, crystalline qualities. She wrote to Pembroke after reading his paper, and they began corresponding, comparing notes, building a larger picture of what was happening. What neither of them fully understood, what the science of the time couldn't yet explain, was why this was happening. They could document the phenomenon, but they couldn't explain the mechanism. We know now, with the benefit of a century of sleep research, that temperature plays a crucial role in regulating sleep stages. Our core body temperature drops as we sleep, reaching its lowest point in the hours before dawn. This temperature minimum is associated with the deepest phases of REM sleep, with the most vivid and memorable dreams. In a natural environment, the falling external temperature reinforces this biological process, helping to trigger and sustain deep REM phases. But in a constantly cooled room, the temperature signal gets confused. The body still tries to lower its core temperature, but the external environment is already cool and staying cool. The normal relationship between external temperature, internal temperature, and sleep stage gets disrupted. And somehow mysteriously, this disruption manifests in dream content that revolves around cold ice and frozen imagery. It's as if the sleeping mind, confused by the mixed signals from its environment, creates dreams that try to make sense of the unnatural thermal experience. By 1915, more researchers were paying attention. Small studies were being conducted in university sleep laboratories. But World War I interrupted this nascent field of research, pulling scientists and funding toward more immediately practical concerns. The war years also saw wider adoption of cooling systems in some settings, particularly in military facilities in hot climates and in hospitals treating wounded soldiers. But nobody was tracking the dreams of soldiers or patients in these cooled spaces. The phenomenon was real, growing, spreading wherever the technology spread, but remaining largely invisible to systematic observation. What makes this history so remarkable is not just that a technology designed for printing and manufacturing accidentally changed human dreaming, but that this change happened so quietly, so gradually, that it was barely noticed even as it unfolded. Willis Carrier never knew about the dream effects. He died in 1950, celebrated as the father of air conditioning, credited with transforming architecture and urban development and quality of life, but probably never aware that his invention had also transformed one of the most intimate and universal human experiences. The printing problem he solved in Brooklyn in 1902 was just the beginning of a transformation that would eventually touch billions of people, altering not just how we sleep, but how we dream, what visions visit us in the night, what strange frozen monarchs reign in the kingdoms of our unconscious minds. The year 1910 marked a quiet turning point in the history of sleep science, though nobody recognized it as such at the time. In laboratories scattered across the northeastern United States and in a few locations in Europe, researchers were beginning to take dreams seriously as objects of scientific inquiry. This was still a radical notion. For most of human history, dreams had been the province of priests and poets, of mystics and madmen. The idea that you could study them systematically, that you could collect them like specimens and analyze them like data, was newer than electric light, newer than the telephone, newer than the very concept of the unconscious mind that was just then being articulated by a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud. Dr. Harrison Pembroke in Boston had assembled what he called a dream registry, a collection of several hundred dream reports gathered from his patients over a 3-year period. He kept them in leather-bound ledgers in his office, each entry carefully dated and annotated with information about the dreamer's age, occupation, health status, and any medications they might be taking. It was meticulous work, tedious work, the kind of painstaking data collection that forms the foundation of scientific breakthroughs but rarely gets celebrated in the history books. Pembroke spent hours each week transcribing the dreams his patients described to him, trying to find patterns, trying to understand what dreams might reveal about the workings of the sleeping mind. In the spring of 1911, he noticed something that made him go back through all his ledgers, checking dates and cross-referencing entries. 7 of his patients had begun reporting dreams dominated by ice and cold imagery within the past year. 7 might not sound like many out of several hundred patients, but these 7 shared something else in common. They all worked at or lived near the textile mill on Harrison Avenue, the one with the new atmospheric control system. Pembroke knew about the system because he'd toured the facility the previous summer out of simple curiosity about the technology. The mill owners were proud of it, eager to show off how the controlled environment had improved their production quality and reduced waste. Pembroke had been impressed by the machinery, but hadn't given much thought to potential health effects. After all, cooler air seemed healthier than the stifling heat of a normal summer. But now he wondered. He began asking these 7 patients more detailed questions about their sleeping arrangements. Where did they sleep? What were the conditions like? How long had they been sleeping in cooled spaces? The answers were remarkably consistent. All 7 had begun experiencing the ice dreams within days or weeks of starting to sleep in artificially cooled rooms. The dreams weren't occasional or isolated. They were recurring, persistent, and strikingly similar in their core imagery, even though the specific narratives varied. One patient, a supervisor at the mill named Thomas Brennan, described a dream he'd had at least a dozen times. Walking through an enormous frozen hall where the walls were made of ice so clear, You could see through them into other frozen rooms beyond, extending infinitely in all directions. In the center of this hall stood a throne made of darker ice, almost black. And on the throne sat a figure that Brennan somehow knew was a king, though he could never quite see the figure's face clearly. Another patient, a woman named Catherine Wells, who lived in an apartment above the mill offices, described dreams of wandering through a winter landscape that never ended, where the sky was the same pale gray as the snow-covered ground, where she could never find shelter or warmth. She would wake from these dreams feeling cold despite the blankets piled on her bed, despite the warm air from the cooling system that kept her room at a constant, comfortable temperature. The coldness in the dreams felt different from normal cold, she told Pembroke. It felt absolute, metaphysical, like the cold at the end of the universe. Pembroke wrote to colleagues asking if they'd observed anything similar. Most hadn't. Cooling systems were still rare enough that most physicians had no patients sleeping in such environments. But Dr. Miriam Ashford in New York wrote back with detailed observations from her own practice. She'd been tracking the dreams of an industrialist named Robert Crenshaw, who had installed cooling in his townhouse the previous autumn. Ashford was more interested in psychological interpretation than Pembroke was, more influenced by the new theories coming from Europe about dream symbolism and unconscious desires. But even she had to admit that the sheer consistency of the ice imagery in Crenshaw's dreams suggested something beyond purely psychological factors. Crenshaw's dream diary, which Ashford had excerpts from, read like dispatches from an Arctic expedition. Night after night, he recorded dreams set in frozen landscapes, ice caves, crystalline palaces. In one recurring dream, he was attending a formal dinner party in a great hall entirely made of ice. The other guests were frozen solid, seated at a long ice table, their faces locked in expressions of polite conversation. He alone could move, walking among them, seeing his reflection distorted in their frozen surfaces. The dream always ended the same way. He would realize that he too was beginning to freeze. That ice was forming on his hands, his arms, creeping up toward his heart. He would wake in a panic, reaching for his chest, relieved to find himself warm and mobile in his cooled bedroom. Ashford sent Pembroke copies of these dream reports, and the two began a correspondence that would continue for years. They weren't the only researchers noticing the phenomenon, but they became the most systematic in documenting it. In Philadelphia, Dr. James Whitmore had begun collecting dream reports from workers at a pharmaceutical plant with new cooling equipment. In Chicago, Dr. Eleanor Vargas was tracking the sleep patterns of administrators who worked in the cooled offices of a meat-packing company. Slowly, carefully, a picture began to emerge from these scattered observations. The dreams typically began within a week of sleeping in artificially cooled spaces. They were most intense and most frequent in the first few months, though they tended to persist as long as the person continued sleeping in cooled environments. The imagery was remarkably consistent across different dreamers' ice, snow-frozen landscapes, crystalline structures, and frequently, almost disturbingly frequently, the figure of a king or monarch associated with cold or ice. Sometimes the king was frozen in ice. Sometimes he sat on a throne of ice. Sometimes he ruled over frozen kingdoms. But the royal figure appeared again and again in reports from people who had no connection to each other, who lived in different cities, who came from different backgrounds and cultures. This consistency was what convinced Pembroke and Ashford that they were observing a genuine phenomenon, rather than coincidence or suggestion. Dream imagery is notoriously personal and idiosyncratic. Yes, there are common dream themes: flying, falling, being chased, losing teeth, but the specific details tend to vary wildly from person to person. Yet here were people from different cities, different social classes, different occupations, all reporting dreams with nearly identical core elements. It seemed to suggest that the artificial cooling was triggering something deep in the human psyche, some archetypal response to unnatural thermal environments. By 1913, Pembroke felt he had enough data to publish more than just his initial cautious observations. He wrote a longer paper detailing the dreams of 23 patients who slept in cooled spaces, comparing them with control groups of patients who slept in naturally ventilated rooms. The paper was more assertive than his first, arguing that artificial atmospheric control was clearly affecting dream content in measurable ways. He submitted it to several medical journals. All of them rejected it. The editors were polite but firm the study was too small, the phenomenon too subjective, the conclusions too speculative. One editor wrote back suggesting that the dreams might simply reflect the cultural novelty of the cooling systems themselves, that people were dreaming about cold because the technology was new and interesting to them. Give it time, the editor suggested, and the dreams would normalize once the technology became commonplace. It was a reasonable hypothesis, but it turned out to be completely wrong. As cooling systems became more common through the 1910s, the ice dreams didn't diminish. If anything, they became more widespread and more intense. By 1915, there were hundreds of documented cases. Ashford had started a formal study with funding from a private foundation, recruiting volunteers who were planning to install cooling systems in their homes. She collected dream diaries from these volunteers for 2 months before the installation, then for 6 months after. The results were striking. Before the cooling, the volunteers' dreams were varied and unpredictable, full of the normal range of human dream imagery. After the cooling, ice and cold began appearing with statistical regularity that couldn't be explained by chance. One of Ashford's volunteers, a school teacher named Margaret Simmons, kept particularly detailed records. Before the cooling system was installed in her apartment, her dreams were what Ashford classified as standard mixed content. Dreams about her students, about her family, about places she'd visited or hoped to visit. Occasional anxiety dreams about being unprepared for class or losing important papers. A normal dream life, in other words, reflecting a normal waking life. But within 3 days of the cooling system being activated, ice entered her dreams. First subtly, she dreamed of a cold draft in her classroom, of frost on windows. Then, more dramatically, she was walking through her school building and realized all the hallways had become ice tunnels, the walls translucent and slick. By the end of the first month, she was having elaborate dreams set entirely in frozen environments. She dreamed of ice palaces and frozen gardens. She dreamed of skating on a lake that was somehow also the sky. And she dreamed repeatedly of a figure she called the Winter King, a tall man in pale robes who stood motionless in the center of a frozen courtyard, his face obscured by falling snow. Simmons found the dreams fascinating rather than frightening. She looked forward to them, to the strange beauty of these frozen dreamscapes. But other volunteers had different reactions. A banker named Howard Chen reported that the ice dreams gave him profound anxiety. He felt trapped in them, lost in endless frozen mazes where every passage looked identical and no exit could be found. He began to dread sleep, began drinking coffee late into the evening to postpone it. After 3 months, he had the cooling system removed from his bedroom, and within a week the ice dreams ceased. His dream life returned to its previous chaotic variety. Ashford noted this carefully. The effect was reversible. Remove the cooling and the dreams normalized, but Chen was unusual. Most people who installed cooling systems kept them, even if the dreams were unsettling. The comfort was too great, especially during the brutal summer heat. They learned to live with the ice dreams, to accept them as the price of comfortable sleep. Some even came to enjoy them, to find meaning or beauty in the frozen imagery. A journalist who was writing about the new technology for a popular magazine spent a week sleeping in a hotel room equipped with cooling, deliberately, to experience the effect. He described the dreams as otherworldly and magnificent, like visiting a realm that exists nowhere on Earth, a kingdom of perpetual winter governed by powers we cannot name. What none of these researchers understood, what they couldn't understand with the scientific tools and knowledge available in 1915, was why this was happening. They could document the effect with increasing precision, but the mechanism remained mysterious. Pembroke hypothesized that the constant temperature interfered with natural body temperature regulation during sleep, somehow affecting the brain's dream generation processes. Ashford leaned toward a more psychological explanation, suggesting that the cooling created an environmental stressor that the dreaming mind processed through symbolic imagery of cold and ice. A researcher in Berlin proposed that the dreams were a form of thermoregulatory hallucination, the brain's attempt to make sense of thermal signals that didn't match expected patterns. All of these theories had some merit, but none fully explained the remarkable consistency of the imagery, particularly the recurring figure of the Ice King. Why that specific symbol? Why did so many independent dreamers conjure the same archetypal figure? Jung would later argue that such symbols emerged from the collective unconscious, from deep structures of meaning shared across humanity. But in 1915, Jung's ideas were still developing, still controversial, and most sleep researchers were more interested in neurological mechanisms than archetypal symbolism. The First World War interrupted much of this research, as wars do. Pembroke joined a military hospital as a consulting neurologist. Ashford shifted her focus to treating soldiers with what was then called shell shock. The careful documentation of ice dreams seemed less urgent when young men were dying in trenches across Europe. But the technology continued to spread. Cooling systems were installed in military facilities, in hospitals, in the homes of those who could afford them. And everywhere they went, the dreams followed, invisible, untracked, but persistent. Soldiers in cooled barracks in Texas dreamed of frozen battlefields. Nurses in cooled hospital wards in Virginia dreamed of ice palaces. Children in cooled nurseries in Manhattan dreamed of snow queens and frozen castles. By the time the war ended in 1918, cooling technology had become more sophisticated, more affordable, more widely adopted. And the dream phenomenon had grown from a curiosity documented by a handful of researchers to a widespread experience affecting thousands of people. Yet it remained largely invisible to the broader public. People experienced the dreams but didn't talk about them much, didn't realize how common they were. Dreams are private, after all, strange and embarrassing to discuss. So the ice dreams spread through the population silently, like a virus with no symptoms but altered consciousness, changing the nighttime experience of more and more people while leaving barely a trace in the historical record. Pembroke and Ashford both tried to revive systematic research after the war, but funding was scarce and institutional interest remained limited. The papers they managed to publish reached small audiences and generated little response. Sleep science was still a marginal field, dream research even more so. The phenomenon was real, documented, replicable, but it remained on the periphery of scientific attention, a curiosity that most researchers felt was less important than other medical priorities in the difficult years after the war. What they couldn't know, sitting in their offices in 1920, reviewing their ledgers full of dream reports, was that they'd documented the beginning of a transformation that would eventually affect billions of people. The ice dreams they'd so carefully cataloged were the first sign of how profoundly technological control of our sleeping environments would reshape human consciousness. They'd glimpsed something important, something that revealed deep connections between our bodies, our environments, and the mysterious processes that generate our dreams. But the full implications wouldn't become clear for decades. Long after both Pembroke and Ashford had passed from the scene, their careful records gathering dust in medical archives, waiting for a future generation of researchers to rediscover what they'd learned about the price we pay for comfortable sleep. The human body is a machine that runs on rhythms, on cycles within cycles, on patterns so ancient and fundamental that they're written into our DNA. Every night when we sleep, We descend through these cycles like a diver moving through layers of ocean, each depth governed by different pressures, different temperatures, different rules. For most of human history, we understood sleep as a single state, a simple shutting down of consciousness until morning. We knew that dreams happened, but we thought they were random, scattered throughout the night like stars appearing unpredictably in a dark sky. We were wrong about almost everything. The revolution in understanding began in 1953 in a basement laboratory at the University of Chicago, where a graduate student named Eugene Acerinsky was supposed to be studying the slow, rolling eye movements that occur as people fall asleep. It was tedious work, watching sleepers for hours, recording their eye movements on long scrolls of paper from a machine that tracked electrical activity. Acerinsky expected the eyes to remain mostly still once sleep deepened, perhaps with occasional slow drifts. Instead, he discovered something that would transform sleep science forever: periods when the eyes moved rapidly, darting back and forth beneath closed lids, as if the sleeper were watching something intensely. When he woke subjects during these periods of rapid eye movement, they almost always reported vivid, detailed dreams. When he woke them during other sleep stages, dream reports were rare and fragmentary. This was REM sleep, though it would take years to fully understand what Acerinsky had stumbled upon. Working with his advisor Nathaniel Kleitman, Acerinsky began mapping the architecture of sleep, discovering that we don't simply sink into unconsciousness and stay there until morning. Instead, we cycle through distinct stages, each with its own brain wave patterns, its own physiological characteristics, its own purpose. We descend through progressively deeper stages of non-REM sleep, then ascend back to periods of REM sleep, where the brain becomes almost as active as when we're awake, where our eyes dart behind closed lids, where our most vivid dreams occur. This cycle repeats 4 or 5 times each night, each complete circuit lasting roughly 90 minutes. But here's what took longer to discover, what required years of careful measurement and observation. Temperature plays a crucial role in orchestrating these cycles. Our core body temperature doesn't remain constant through the night. It falls as we sleep, dropping by as much as 2 degrees Fahrenheit, reaching its lowest point in the early morning hours before dawn. This temperature minimum isn't random. It's synchronized with the deepest, most intense periods of REM sleep. When our body temperature hits its nadir, when we're coldest, that's when we experience the longest, most elaborate REM periods, the ones that generate our most vivid and memorable dreams. This relationship between temperature and REM sleep is so fundamental that it seems to be universal among mammals. Rats show it, cats show it, whales and elephants show it, though they sleep differently than we do in many ways. The cooling of the body during sleep appears to be part of the ancient machinery of mammalian rest, a mechanism that evolved hundreds of millions of years ago and has been conserved across countless species because it works, because it serves some essential function we're still trying to fully understand. In humans, the process begins even before we fall asleep. As evening approaches, as light fades from the sky, our bodies start preparing for sleep through a complex cascade of hormonal and neural changes. The pineal gland deep in our brains begins secreting melatonin, that crucial sleep hormone. But melatonin doesn't just make us drowsy. It also triggers vasodilation in our extremities, opening up blood vessels in our hands and feet, allowing heat to radiate away from our core. This is why people often feel cold just before falling asleep, why we instinctively curl up or pull blankets around us. Our bodies are deliberately cooling themselves, initiating the temperature drop that will help us transition into sleep and maintain the proper cycling through sleep stages. As we descend into the first cycle of sleep, moving through the lighter stages into deep, slow wave sleep, our temperature continues to fall. The body's metabolic rate decreases. We produce less heat. The thermoregulatory center in the hypothalamus, which normally works to maintain our temperature at a stable 98.6 degrees, effectively lowers its set point, allowing us to cool. By the time we enter our first REM period of the night, perhaps 90 minutes after falling asleep, our core temperature has dropped noticeably. But that first REM period is usually brief, just a few minutes, and our dreams during it tend to be fragmentary and unmemorable. The cycle repeats. We descend again through non-REM stages. Our temperature continues its gradual decline. We rise again into REM, and this period lasts longer, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. The dreams are more elaborate, more narrative, though we may not remember them in the morning. Again, we cycle down and up, and each time we enter REM sleep, the period lasts longer and the dreams become more intense. By the fourth or fifth cycle, in the hours before dawn, we may spend 30 minutes or more in continuous REM sleep, experiencing dreams that feel as real and complex as waking life. And this is where temperature becomes critical. These long, deep REM periods in the early morning occur precisely when our body temperature reaches its minimum. When we're at our coldest point in the 24-hour cycle, research has shown that artificially lowering someone's core temperature can increase the duration and intensity of REM sleep. Conversely, warming someone can suppress REM sleep, shortening the periods and reducing dream vividness. The relationship is so reliable that sleep researchers can manipulate dream intensity simply by adjusting ambient temperature or using special suits that heat or cool specific parts of the body. But here's where it gets complicated, where the simple story about temperature and REM becomes entangled with the history of air conditioning and those mysterious ice dreams that researchers in the 1910s were just beginning to document. In a natural sleeping environment, the kind humans experienced for millions of years, the ambient temperature drops during the night. When our ancestors slept in caves or simple shelters, when they slept outdoors under the stars, the air around them grew progressively cooler as night deepened. The coldest moment of the night, the hour before dawn, coincided perfectly with their body's temperature minimum and their deepest REM periods. External cooling reinforced internal cooling, everything synchronized. But an air-conditioned room doesn't work that way. The temperature remains constant, hour after hour. The thermostat maintains whatever setting has been chosen, 55 degrees or 65 or 75, unchanging through the night. And this constancy creates a mismatch between what our bodies expect and what they actually experience. Our core temperature still tries to follow its ancient pattern, still drops toward its minimum in the early morning hours. But the external temperature signal that should reinforce this process is absent. Instead of steadily falling ambient temperature, we experience constant temperature. Instead of a clear signal that guides our body through its normal thermal trajectory, we get a flat line. A monotone that conveys no information about time or depth of sleep. The sleeping brain, faced with this unnatural situation, seems to respond by intensifying certain aspects of REM sleep. Multiple studies conducted from the 1950s onward have found that people sleeping in constantly cooled rooms tend to have longer REM periods and report more vivid dreams than people sleeping in naturally ventilated spaces where temperature varies. At first, researchers thought this was simply because constant coolness allowed for deeper sleep overall, less interrupted by discomfort. And there's some truth to that. People do sleep more continuously in comfortably cool rooms. But the effect is more specific than general sleep quality. It's particularly pronounced in REM sleep and in dream vividness. One theory developed in the 1960s by a researcher named Dr. Alan Rechtschaffen at the University of Chicago suggests that the brain interprets the constant cool temperature as a prolonged temperature minimum, as if the coldest part of the night were lasting for hours instead of occurring briefly before dawn. In response, the brain extends and intensifies REM periods, trying to make use of this apparent optimal window for REM sleep. It's as if the thermoregulatory system and the sleep system are having a confused conversation. The sleep system keeps saying, "We're at minimum temperature. time for deep REM, and the thermoregulatory system keeps responding. Yes, we're still there, still at minimum, hour after hour, in a loop that never resolves the way it would in a natural environment where temperature rises with approaching dawn. This extended, intensified REM sleep produces dreams that are not just more vivid but qualitatively different. Dream researchers who've analyzed thousands of dream reports have found that dreams from artificially cooled sleep tend to be more sensory, more immersive, more emotionally intense than dreams from naturally varying temperature environments. People report feeling more physically present in these dreams, more aware of textures and temperatures and physical sensations, and crucially, they report better dream recall. The dreams from cooled sleep are more likely to be remembered in the morning, more likely to be recounted in detail, more likely to leave a lasting impression on waking consciousness. This better recall may be because the dreams are genuinely more intense, more memorable in themselves, but it may also be because the unnatural temperature environment affects the transition from sleep to waking. In a natural environment, our body temperature begins rising before we wake, responding to the warming air of dawn. This gradual warming helps orchestrate a gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness, allowing us to surface slowly from dreams. But in a constantly cooled room, there's no such temperature signal to guide the awakening process. We may wake more abruptly, jolting out of deep REM sleep with the dream still vivid and immediate, not yet faded by the usual gradual transition. There's also evidence, though it's more controversial, that the specific content of dreams may be influenced by the thermal environment. This brings us back to those ice dreams that early researchers documented, those frozen landscapes and crystal palaces and recurring images of cold. Modern sleep scientists have found that external temperature can indeed influence dream content, but usually in fairly straightforward ways. If you're too cold, you dream about being cold. If you're too hot, you dream about heat. But the ice dreams reported from air-conditioned spaces aren't simple reflections of being cold. The rooms are comfortable, not frigid. The dreamers aren't experiencing thermal discomfort, yet their dreams fill with elaborate imagery of cold and ice and frozen realms. One explanation proposed by Dr. Sarah Chen in a 1998 paper suggests that the dreams reflect not the actual temperature, but the unnaturalness of the temperature constancy. The sleeping brain has evolved to expect temperature variation, to use that variation as information about time and sleep depth. When that variation is absent, when temperature remains flatlined hour after hour, the brain may interpret this as something wrong, something unnatural about the thermal environment, and it may express this wrongness through dream imagery of impossible cold, of frozen wastes, of ice that shouldn't exist but does. The ice in these dreams isn't about being cold, it's about being in a thermal environment that feels fundamentally wrong, that violates deep expectations about how temperature should behave during sleep. Another line of research has focused on how REM sleep itself may create the conditions for these particular dream images. During REM sleep, our bodies enter a state of near paralysis, with most voluntary muscles temporarily shut down to prevent us from acting out our dreams. But thermoregulation also changes dramatically during REM. We essentially become cold-blooded during these periods, unable to shiver or sweat, unable to actively regulate our temperature. We rely entirely on the ambient environment to maintain thermal comfort. In a naturally varying temperature environment, this isn't a problem. The external temperature is usually moderate during REM periods. But in a constantly cooled room, the body during REM sleep may actually experience something closer to genuine cold than it does during other sleep stages, when active thermoregulation is still partially functioning. This REM-specific cooling might explain why the ice dreams are so vivid and so memorable. They're occurring during the periods when we're most dream-prone and simultaneously most vulnerable to thermal stress, even if that stress is mild. The combination creates dreams that are both intensely experienced and thematically organized around coldness and ice. We're not just dreaming about being cold. We're having extended, elaborate REM experiences while our bodies are in an unusual thermal state, and that state shapes the dreams from the inside, so to speak. Research from the 2000s using brain imaging during sleep has added another layer to our understanding. Scientists can now watch the sleeping brain in action, seeing which regions activate during different sleep stages and in response to different stimuli. They've found that during REM sleep in cooled environments, there's unusual activation in parts of the brain associated with spatial navigation and with processing unfamiliar or disorienting environments. It's as if the brain is working harder during these dreams to make sense of where it is, to map out the dream space, to understand the logic of the frozen landscapes it's generating. This extra cognitive work may contribute to why these dreams feel so immersive and so strange, so unlike normal dream experiences. The implications of all this research extend far beyond the curiosity of ice dreams. We're discovering that temperature is not just a comfort factor for sleep, but a fundamental regulator of consciousness itself during rest. The way we manage temperature in our sleeping environments shapes not just how well we sleep, but how we dream, what we experience during those 8 hours of unconsciousness, how our memories consolidate, how our emotions process, how our creativity functions. When we decided, as a civilization, to start sleeping in constantly cooled rooms, we weren't just making ourselves more comfortable. We were conducting an uncontrolled experiment on human consciousness, altering one of the key environmental variables that has shaped mammalian sleep for hundreds of millions of years. And we're still living with the results of that experiment, still trying to understand its full implications. Every night, millions of people sleep in temperature-controlled environments, experiencing extended REM periods and vivid dreams that their ancestors never knew. Some of those dreams are beautiful, transcendent experiences in frozen realms of impossible beauty. Some are anxious wanderings through cold labyrinths where warmth can never be found. All of them are shaped by the subtle, but profound effects of constant temperature on the ancient machinery of sleep, on the delicate dance between cooling bodies and dreaming minds, on the REM revolution that transformed both how we understand sleep and how we experience it. There are moments in human history when something shifts beneath the surface of ordinary life, when patterns emerge that nobody designed or predicted, when thousands of people independently experience something so similar that it demands explanation. The Ice King phenomenon was one of those moments, though it unfolded so quietly, so privately, that it took decades before anyone realized how widespread it had become. These were dreams, after all, and dreams are private things rarely discussed in detail, easily dismissed as random noise generated by sleeping brains. But the pattern was there, persistent and undeniable once anyone bothered to look for it. The first comprehensive documentation came in 1923 when Dr. Miriam Ashford published a monograph titled Recurrent Symbolic Elements in Dreams of Subjects Sleeping in Atmospherically Controlled Environments. It was dense, academic prose published by a small university press, the kind of book that rarely found readers outside a narrow circle of specialists. But buried in its pages was something remarkable: dream reports from 47 individuals, none of whom knew each other, living in 7 different cities across the United States and 2 in England, all describing essentially the same figure: a king associated with ice and cold, sometimes seated on a throne, sometimes standing in a frozen wasteland, sometimes trapped within ice itself, always male, always solitary, always radiating an aura of immense power and equally immense isolation. Ashford had collected these reports over a 6-year period, corresponding with other researchers, gathering dream diaries, interviewing patients and volunteers. She'd expected to find some commonalities. That's what dream research often reveals: common themes and symbols that recur across different dreamers. But the specificity of what she found surprised even her. These weren't just dreams about cold or ice. They were dreams about a particular figure, described in strikingly similar terms by people who had no contact with each other, who came from different backgrounds, different cultures, different walks of life. A factory worker in Pittsburgh described dreaming repeatedly of a tall man in pale robes, sitting on a throne carved from a single massive block of ice, in a hall where the walls were made of frozen waterfalls, where everything was blue and white and utterly silent. A banker's wife in Manhattan described an identical throne room, down to the frozen waterfall walls, though she'd never been to Pittsburgh, had never met the factory worker, had never read any accounts of his dreams. A shipping clerk in London reported seeing, night after night, a crowned figure standing at the center of a frozen lake that stretched to the horizon in all directions, the ice beneath him darker than the ice surrounding him, as if he were sinking slowly through it or rising from beneath it. The consistency was unnerving. Ashford included detailed tables in her monograph. Breaking down the common elements, the king figure appeared in 93% of the recurring ice dreams she'd documented. The throne appeared in 68%. The sense of the king being trapped or imprisoned appeared in 79%. The feeling that the king was somehow responsible for the cold, that he created it or embodied it or controlled it, appeared in 85%. These weren't vague similarities. These were specific, detailed correspondences that couldn't be explained by cultural contamination or shared exposure to stories and myths. Because Ashford had done her homework. She'd researched the dreamers' backgrounds, their reading habits, their exposure to folklore and fairy tales. Yes, there were stories about winter kings and ice queens in various cultural traditions. Hans Christian Andersen's Snow Queen had been published in 1844 and was widely read. Norse mythology had its frost giants. Russian folklore had Morosko, the winter demon. But the figure appearing in these dreams didn't quite match any of these cultural archetypes. He was more remote, more alien, more fundamentally other than the anthropomorphic winter spirits of folklore. And critically, many of the dreamers had no particular exposure to these stories. Some were immigrants who'd grown up with entirely different mythological traditions. Some were children too young to have read much of anything. Yet they all encountered the same figure in their dreams. What made the phenomenon even stranger was its geographic specificity. The Ice King dreams appeared almost exclusively among people sleeping in artificially cooled environments. Ashford found only 2 cases, out of hundreds she investigated, where someone reported these dreams without sleeping in such conditions. And when people stopped sleeping in cooled rooms, the dreams usually ceased within a few weeks. When they resumed sleeping in cooled spaces, the dreams returned. The connection was so reliable that Ashford began to see it as a kind of diagnostic marker. If a patient reported Ice King dreams, she could be fairly confident they were sleeping in an atmospherically controlled environment, even if they didn't mention it. By the late 1920s, as air conditioning spread through hotels and department stores and office buildings, the reports multiplied. A hotel manager in Miami noted that guests who stayed in the newly cooled rooms often mentioned having vivid dreams about ice in winter, which seemed odd given that they were in Florida, surrounded by tropical heat. Some guests found the dreams pleasant, a refreshing mental escape from the sweltering climate. Others found them disturbing, a disorienting contrast with their waking environment. Several guests described the same figure, a king in a frozen palace, watching them with eyes that might have been compassionate or might have been completely indifferent. They couldn't tell which. In Chicago, a department store that had installed cooling in its offices conducted an informal survey of employees after several of them mentioned having strange dreams. More than half reported dreams involving ice or winter scenes. A third specifically mentioned seeing a royal or regal figure in these dreams. One clerk, a young woman named Helen Morrison, described a dream so vivid that she'd written it down immediately upon waking. I was in a great hall made entirely of ice, so clear I could see through the walls to other rooms beyond, rooms that went on forever. In the center was a throne, and on the throne sat a king. He wore a crown that looked like it was made of frost, and his robes were the color of very old ice, almost blue. He didn't move or speak, but I knew he was aware of me. I felt that he had been there for a very long time, perhaps forever, and would continue to be there forever, that the ice was both his kingdom and his prison. I felt terribly sad for him, though I didn't know why. Morrison's description became something of a template as researchers began collecting these reports more systematically. The sadness, the sense of the king being both powerful and trapped, the crystalline clarity of the ice, the endless halls or landscapes, the timelessness. These elements appeared again and again. A pattern within the pattern began to emerge. The dreams seemed to progress or develop over time for individual dreamers. The first Ice King dream someone had was usually simpler, more fragmentary. They might just glimpse a frozen throne room or catch sight of a crowned figure in the distance. But if they continued sleeping in cooled environments, the dreams became more elaborate, more detailed, more immersive. It was as if the sleeping mind was gradually constructing a more complete vision of this frozen realm and its solitary ruler. Dr. Harrison Pembroke, still corresponding with Ashford even as his health declined, wrote to her in 1927 with an observation that troubled him. It's as if the cooling systems are giving people access to the same dream space, as if there's a place in the collective unconscious that only becomes accessible under these specific thermal conditions. Jung would have a field day with this, but I don't know that his theories adequately explain the specificity of what we're observing. This isn't just an archetype bubbling up from the depths of the psyche. This is something more precise, more consistent, almost as if it's a real place that people are visiting in their dreams. Pembroke didn't really believe there was a literal frozen realm that people were accessing in their sleep. He was too much a materialist, too committed to finding physiological explanations. But he was grasping towards something important. The phenomenon didn't feel random. It felt organized, structured, as if there were rules governing who saw the Ice King and under what circumstances. And those rules seemed to be primarily thermal. Get the temperature conditions right, constant coolness, unchanging through the night, and the Ice King appeared. Let the temperature vary naturally, and he vanished back into whatever region of the unconscious he inhabited. By the 1930s, the phenomenon had spread internationally as cooling technology reached Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world. And this is where the cultural consistency became even more striking. A Japanese businessman sleeping in a newly cooled hotel in Tokyo reported dreaming of a figure he called the Frozen Emperor, sitting on a throne in a palace of ice. A Brazilian doctor sleeping in a cooled room in Rio de Janeiro described dreams of an ice sovereign, ruling over frozen wastes. The specific cultural framing varied slightly, emperor versus king, palace versus castle, but the core elements remained constant: a male authority figure, associated with ice and cold, existing in a state of isolated power that felt simultaneously eternal and imprisoned. Some researchers tried to explain this cross-cultural consistency by arguing that the dreams reflected fundamental human anxieties about technology and control. Air conditioning was, after all, a technology of control, of imposing human will on natural processes, of creating artificial climates. Perhaps, these researchers suggested, the Ice King represented our ambivalence about this control. Our sense that in gaining power over our environment, we were also trapping ourselves, isolating ourselves from something essential and natural. The king's frozen throne was a metaphor for technological mastery that had become a kind of prison. It was a plausible interpretation, but it didn't explain why the metaphor took such a specific form, why it appeared so consistently across different individuals and cultures. If the dreams were simply expressing anxiety about technology, why always a king? Why always ice? Why not dreams of machines or factories or clockwork? Why this particular symbolic vocabulary? Another theory proposed by a Jungian analyst named Dr. Friedrich Hartmann in 1934 suggested that the Ice King represented an archetype of the self in a state of frozen potential, unable to grow or change, suspended in perfect but sterile preservation. The artificially cooled environment, Hartmann argued, created a kind of temporal suspension, a removal from natural cycles, and the psyche responded by generating images of frozen royalty to represent this suspension. The king was who we might become if we achieved perfect control and perfect preservation, immortal, powerful, but utterly alone and unable to develop further. Hartmann's theory was elegant and psychologically sophisticated, but it was also unprovable and, to many researchers, unnecessarily mystical. The more neurologically minded scientists looked for physical explanations. Maybe the constant cool temperature affected specific brain regions during REM sleep, regions associated with processing social hierarchy or generating symbolic representations of authority. Maybe there was something about the thermal conditions that preferentially activated neural pathways related to isolation and coldness, which the dreaming mind then clothed in the culturally available imagery of frozen monarchs. But none of these explanations quite captured the strangeness of the lived experience. People who had Ice King dreams didn't feel like they were experiencing metaphors or symbols generated by their own brains. They felt like they were visiting somewhere, encountering someone. The phenomenology of these dreams was distinct from normal dreaming. They had a quality of otherness, of encountering something that existed independently of the dreamer's own mind and psychology. A woman named Dorothy Riordan, who worked as a telephone operator in Boston and slept in a cooled rooming house, kept a detailed dream diary from 1931 to 1936. Her entries show the development of her relationship, if that's the right word, with the Ice King over 5 years of recurring dreams. At first, she only glimpsed him from a distance, a figure on a throne in a hall she couldn't quite reach. Gradually, over months, she found herself able to enter the hall, to walk closer to the throne. The king never moved, never spoke, but she felt increasingly that he was aware of her presence, that he was in some way acknowledging her visits. By 1934, she was having dreams where she would sit at the base of the throne and tell the king about her waking life, about her struggles and hopes, and though he never responded, she felt heard, understood in a way she rarely felt during her waking hours. "I know it sounds mad," she wrote in her diary in 1935, "but I've come to care about him, this frozen king in my dreams. I worry about him, trapped there in his ice palace. I wish I could free him, though I don't know from what or how. Sometimes I think he's been waiting there forever, waiting for something or someone, and all of us who visit him in dreams are somehow part of what he's waiting for, though none of us knows what that means." Riordan's diary entries were later studied by researchers as an example of how the Ice King dreams could develop depth and emotional complexity over time. But they also highlighted something troubling. The dreams could become important to the dreamers, could take on emotional weight and significance that affected their waking lives. Some people, like Riordan, formed what almost seemed like relationships with the dream figure. Others became obsessed with understanding who or what the Ice King was, spending their waking hours trying to decipher the meaning of their nighttime visions. A small number of people reported negative experiences. A man in Philadelphia claimed the Ice King appeared in his dreams, not as a passive figure on a throne, but as an actively threatening presence, pursuing him through frozen labyrinths, always just behind him, radiating cold that seemed to freeze his thoughts and emotions. He had the cooling system removed from his apartment and refused to sleep in cooled spaces afterward, even during the worst summer heat. When interviewed by researchers, he said simply, "There's something wrong there, in that cold place. Something that shouldn't be disturbed. We're not meant to sleep that way, in that unchanging cold. We're waking something up, or calling to something, and it's noticing us now. Most people didn't have such extreme reactions, but there was something in what the man said that resonated with broader anxieties about the phenomenon. By the late 1930s, as the dreams had been documented across thousands of cases, a few researchers were beginning to wonder whether the technology was doing more than just affecting individual dream content. What if, they speculated, the cooling systems were somehow linking dreamers together, creating a shared dream space that multiple people could access simultaneously? What if the Ice King wasn't being generated independently by thousands of individual brains, but was somehow emerging from the collective dreaming of all these people in artificially cooled environments? It was a fringe theory, dismissed by most mainstream researchers as mystical nonsense with no basis in neuroscience or psychology. But it captured something about the phenomenology that more conventional explanations missed: the sense of encounter, of meeting something rather than generating something, that so many dreamers reported. The Ice King felt real to them in a way that normal dream characters didn't. He felt like someone they were meeting rather than someone they were creating. As air conditioning became more common through the 1940s and 1950s, the Ice King dreams became so widespread that they almost stopped being remarked upon. They became part of the background of modern life, something millions of people experienced but rarely discussed. The phenomenon had been documented, analyzed, theorized about, but never fully explained. And as new generations grew up sleeping exclusively in temperature-controlled environments, they came to accept these frozen visions as simply part of what dreaming was, not realizing that their grandparents, sleeping in naturally ventilated rooms, had never encountered the Ice King at all, had never visited those crystalline palaces, or felt the weight of that frozen monarch's gaze. The dreams continue to this day, reported by people around the world who sleep in cooled rooms, a strange legacy of technology intersecting with consciousness in ways nobody predicted or intended. The Ice King sits on his throne, eternal and isolated, visited nightly by millions of dreamers who don't realize they're sharing this vision, who wake with fragmentary memories of frozen halls and feel a strange sadness they can't quite explain, a longing for or mourning of something they can't name. For 99% of human history, we slept the way our bodies evolved to sleep, in rhythm with the planet itself, rising and falling with the sun, cooling and warming with the night and day, our internal clocks synchronized with external reality, in ways so fundamental we barely noticed them. Our ancestors didn't think about sleep the way we do. They didn't optimize it or measure it or worry about getting enough of it. They simply slept when darkness came and woke when light returned, and their bodies knew exactly what to do, because every cell, every system, every rhythm had been shaped over millions of years to work in concert with the natural cycles of temperature and light that governed life on Earth. Imagine sleeping in a cave 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, somewhere in what would eventually be called France. You've spent the day hunting, gathering, preparing food, tending the fire, doing the 1,000 small tasks that survival demands. As the sun sets, as the light drains from the sky, your body begins its nightly transformation. Your core temperature starts to drop, not because you're getting cold, but because your hypothalamus is initiating the complex cascade of changes that will carry you into sleep. The fire burns down to coals. The air in the cave, which was almost warm during the day from the fire and the body heat of your family group, begins to cool noticeably. You curl up in furs and skins, pressing close to others for warmth, and you drift into sleep as the temperature continues to fall. The cold wakes you sometime in the deep night, not fully, not to complete wakefulness, but to a state between sleeping and waking that our ancestors knew intimately, a state we've almost entirely lost in the modern world. In this state, you're aware of your body, aware of the cold, aware of the darkness and the breathing of others around you. You might tend the fire, adding wood, stirring the coals. You might relieve yourself. You might lie awake for a while, thinking thoughts that move with the slow logic of the night mind, thoughts that don't quite cohere into the linear narratives of daytime consciousness. Then you slide back into sleep, into a second sleep that carries you toward morning, and this sleep is different from the first, deeper in some ways, more filled with dreams. The kind of sleep where you journey to other realms, where you meet spirits and ancestors, where you receive visions that might guide your waking life. This pattern of sleep, divided into segments by a period of quiet wakefulness, was nearly universal among humans until very recently. The historian Roger Akirch discovered references to it scattered throughout historical documents from medieval and early modern Europe, first sleep and second sleep, with a watch or waking period between them. This wasn't insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was how people naturally slept when they weren't being influenced by artificial light or temperature control. When they were simply following their bodies' own rhythms in concert with the environment around them. And the dreams that came during this segmented sleep were different from the dreams we experience today. They were more intense, more meaningful, more likely to be remembered and pondered and integrated into waking life. The anthropologist Carol Worthman, who studied sleep patterns in traditional societies that still live without electricity or climate control, found that people in these societies have more elaborate dream lives than people in industrialized nations. They remember more dreams, discuss them more, attribute more significance to them. Dreams aren't just random neural noise to be dismissed upon waking. They're messages, guidance, connections to dimensions of reality that are just as real as the physical world, perhaps more real in some ways. The temperature fluctuations through the night were part of what made these dreams possible. As the air cooled in the deepest part of the night, as your body reached its lowest temperature point, you entered extended periods of REM sleep filled with vivid, elaborate dreams. But unlike in a modern climate-controlled room, the temperature didn't stay constant. It began to rise again before dawn, slowly at first, then more noticeably as the sun approached the horizon. This rising temperature helped orchestrate your transition back to waking consciousness. You didn't jolt awake to an alarm. You surfaced gradually, naturally, carried up through lighter sleep stages by the warming air and the increasing light, often with your dreams still fresh and accessible in your mind. The seasonal variations were even more profound. In winter, in most climates, the nights were long and cold. People slept more, sometimes substantially more than in summer. There are historical accounts from Northern Europe of people sleeping 10 or 12 hours during the darkest winter months, spending much of their time in bed or around fires, in a state that wasn't quite full wakefulness, but wasn't quite sleep either. A kind of dormancy, almost like hibernation, a deep rest that allowed the body to conserve energy and repair itself during the harshest season. And the dreams of winter were different from summer dreams. Deeper, stranger, more populated by figures and symbols that seemed to come from outside the dreamer's individual psyche. In many traditional cultures, winter was recognized as the season of dreaming, when the boundaries between the spirit world and the waking world grew thin, when the long, dark nights opened doors in consciousness that remained closed during the busier, brighter summer months. The Norse had their concept of the wild hunt, supernatural processions that rode through the winter night. The Celtic peoples recognized the winter months as a time when the other world was more accessible. Indigenous peoples across the northern hemisphere had winter ceremonies centered on dreams and visions, on receiving guidance from the spirit realm during the season, when the physical world seemed most dormant and asleep. These weren't just cultural inventions or superstitions. They were responses to real changes in how people experienced consciousness during different seasons, changes driven largely by temperature and light. When you sleep in a cold environment, when your body must work to maintain warmth, When you cycle between deeper cold in the night and gradual warming toward dawn, your brain behaves differently than it does in constant temperature. Your dreams have different qualities, access different content, follow different narrative and emotional arcs. Summer sleep was lighter, more fragmented, full of brief dreams tied closely to daily life. You'd wake multiple times through the short warm nights, perhaps sleeping outside to catch whatever breezes might provide relief from the heat. Your dreams would be of immediate concerns: the crops, the herds, the work that needed doing. But winter sleep, long and deep and cold, produced dreams that felt like journeys to distant places, encounters with beings that were more than just recycled memories or psychological constructs. The anthropologist Barbara Tedlock, studying dream practices among the Zuni people, found that winter dreams were considered more powerful, more prophetic, more worthy of ceremonial attention than summer dreams. The cold itself was seen as a kind of purifying force that prepared the dreamer to receive clearer, truer visions. The biological mechanisms underlying these differences are something we're only beginning to understand with modern sleep science. We know now that cold exposure affects the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly serotonin and dopamine, which play crucial roles in regulating mood and consciousness. We know that the stress of cold activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, releasing hormones that affect everything from memory consolidation to emotional processing. We know that brown fat, which generates heat in response to cold, produces hormones that affect brain function and may influence dream content and intensity. Our ancestors didn't know any of this in scientific terms, but they knew it experientially. They knew that sleep in winter felt different from sleep in summer. They knew that the dreams that came in the coldest part of the night were different from dreams earlier or later. They knew that temperature mattered, that it was part of the language the body and the mind used to communicate with each other and with the world around them. Consider the experience of sleeping outdoors, something humans did for most of our existence as a species. You'd lie down as the day's warmth faded, and you'd feel the temperature dropping around you, the heat radiating away from your body into the cooling earth and air. Your body would respond by constricting blood vessels in your extremities, by curling into positions that minimized heat loss, by seeking whatever shelter or companionship might provide warmth. And as you slept, the temperature would continue to fall, reaching its minimum perhaps an hour before dawn. You'd be cold then, cold enough that your sleep would lighten, that you'd hover near wakefulness. And this is when the most vivid dreams would come, dreams that felt sharp and clear and real because you were balanced on the edge between sleeping and waking, because the cold was keeping you from falling too deeply into unconsciousness. Then dawn would approach and the temperature would begin to rise, just slightly at first, but enough that your body would sense the change. The warmth would pull you up through sleep stages gently, gradually, until you woke naturally, perhaps at the exact moment the sun crested the horizon. This wasn't coincidence or luck. It was the result of millions of years of evolution synchronizing your internal rhythms with external reality, creating a biological system so precisely calibrated to natural temperature fluctuations that it could use them as a clock, as a guide through the landscape of sleep and waking. We've lost almost all of this. When you sleep in a climate-controlled room set to 70 degrees, your body doesn't experience any of these temperature cues. The thermostat maintains constant temperature regardless of what's happening outside, regardless of the time of night, regardless of the season. Your body's ancient mechanisms for using temperature information to regulate sleep and dreaming are still there, still trying to function. But they're receiving signals that don't make sense, that don't correlate with anything real about your position in time or space or season. The dreams that result are strange hybrids, products of a brain trying to dream in the old way while trapped in an environment that provides no natural guidance. This is why the ice dreams are so common, so persistent. The constant cool temperature is interpreted by the ancient sleep systems as perpetual winter, as endless night, as the coldest hour before dawn extending indefinitely. The dreaming mind, confused by these signals, generates imagery of frozen landscapes and endless winter, because that's the metaphorical vocabulary it has for making sense of what it's experiencing. Cold that doesn't change, darkness that doesn't lead to dawn, winter that never turns to spring. In traditional societies that still exist today, where people sleep in naturally ventilated dwellings without temperature control, researchers have found that dream patterns remain closely tied to seasonal changes. The anthropologist Thomas Greger, studying the Mihinaku people of Brazil, found that their dreams varied predictably with the seasons, becoming more elaborate and spiritual during the cooler, dry season, more focused on immediate practical concerns during the hot, wet season. The Mihinaku themselves were quite conscious of this pattern, adjusting their ceremonial and social practices to take advantage of what they considered the superior dreaming of the dry season. The Kung people of the Kalahari Desert, studied extensively by the anthropologist Richard Katz, reported similar seasonal dream variations. Winter dreams, during the cold desert nights, were more likely to involve encounters with spirits and ancestors, more likely to provide healing visions or prophetic information. Summer dreams during the hot nights when sleep was shallow and frequently interrupted were more mundane, more forgettable. The Kung didn't think this was mysterious or strange. It was simply how dreaming worked, as natural and predictable as the seasonal changes in the landscape around them. What's fascinating is that when members of traditional societies move to urban areas and begin sleeping in climate-controlled environments, their dream patterns change. Within months, they begin reporting dreams more similar to those of industrialized populations, more anxiety-driven, more fragmented, less seasonal variation, less sense of encountering something numinous or spiritually significant. The content shifts from encounters with spirits and ancestors to more mundane concerns about money and work and social status. Some researchers have interpreted this as simply cultural assimilation, as people adopting the concerns and perspectives of their new environment. But the speed of the change suggests something more immediate, something physiological. Change the thermal environment of sleep, and you change the dreams themselves, regardless of culture or belief system. There's a poignant irony in this. We developed air conditioning to make ourselves more comfortable, to escape the tyranny of climate, to create optimal environments for rest and productivity, and we succeeded in a way. We sleep more continuously in climate-controlled rooms. We're less disturbed by heat and cold. We can maintain consistent schedules regardless of season or weather. But we've also lost something that our ancestors possessed without even trying: a dream life, deeply connected to natural rhythms. Dreams that varied with the seasons and the night, and the temperature in ways that felt meaningful. That provided guidance and insight and connection to dimensions of experience that seem increasingly remote to modern consciousness. Some sleep researchers are now experimenting with variable temperature sleeping environments, trying to recreate some aspects of natural temperature fluctuation in controlled settings. The results have been promising but also unsettling. When people sleep in rooms where the temperature is programmed to drop through the night and rise toward dawn, mimicking natural patterns, they report dreaming more like people in traditional societies do. More vivid dreams, more memorable dreams, more dreams that feel significant and meaningful. But they also report the return of something else, that period of nighttime waking between first and second sleep. That quiet watch in the deep night that was universal among our ancestors, but has almost disappeared from modern life. Most modern people find this waking period disturbing at first. We've been taught that good sleep means sleeping through the night without waking, that any interruption is a problem to be solved. The idea that you might naturally wake in the middle of the night, and lie awake for an hour, not anxious or troubled but simply quiet and thoughtful, seems wrong to us, pathological even. But historical evidence suggests this was completely normal, even valued. For most of human history, it was a time for reflection, for prayer or meditation, for quiet conversation with a sleeping partner, for tending to practical matters like feeding the fire, and crucially, it was a time when dreams from the first sleep were fresh and could be contemplated before sliding into the second sleep and its own different dreams. We've engineered this out of our lives, along with the temperature fluctuations, along with the seasonal variations in sleep duration, along with the intimate connection between our sleeping bodies and the natural world around us. We sleep in boxes maintained at constant temperature year-round, divorced from the rhythms that shaped our evolution, and we wonder why our dreams feel hollow, why sleep feels less restorative than it should, why we wake feeling disconnected from something we can't quite name. We've gained comfort and control, but we've lost the ancient conversation between our sleeping selves and the living planet, lost the dreams that came from that conversation, lost access to dimensions of consciousness that opened naturally when we slept the way our bodies were designed to sleep, in rhythm with the cooling night and the warming dawn, with winter's deep cold and summer's brief darkness, with all the temperature variations that told our sleeping brains where we were in time and space and season, that guided us through the territories of dream with the sure hand of millions of years of evolutionary wisdom. The Carrier Corporation was nervous. It was 1928, and they were poised on the edge of something enormous, a transformation of American life that would make their founder Willis Carrier into a household name and revolutionize architecture, urban planning, and the very concept of comfort. But there was a problem, a small problem that threatened to become larger if it wasn't handled carefully. People were talking about the dreams. Not many people, not yet, but enough that the company's publicity department had taken notice. Reports were filtering in from hotels and office buildings where cooling systems had been installed. Guests and workers were having strange dreams, vivid dreams, disturbing dreams about ice and cold and frozen landscapes. It wasn't a major complaint. The cooling systems were still overwhelmingly popular, still seen as miraculous advances in comfort and luxury. But the dreams were there, hovering at the edge of public consciousness, and the Carrier Corporation knew that negative publicity, even about something as intangible as dreams, could derail their ambitious expansion plans. The company had already invested millions in what was, even by the standards of the time, an audacious marketing campaign. They were trying to convince Americans that air conditioning wasn't just a luxury for the wealthy or a necessity for specific industrial applications, but something every home, every business, every public building should have. They were selling a vision of modern life where summer heat was as obsolete as darkness before electric light, where human beings finally had complete control over their indoor environment. This was heady stuff. This was progress incarnate, and nothing could be allowed to interfere with the message. In early 1928, the company's vice president of marketing, a man named Charles Eckhart, received a memo from his publicity team alerting him to a series of articles that were about to be published in medical journals about the psychological effects of sleeping in cooled environments. The research had been conducted by Dr. Miriam Ashford and several colleagues, and while it was couched in careful scientific language, the implications were clear. Air conditioning was changing how people dreamed, and not necessarily in ways that were pleasant or beneficial. Eckhart read the memo twice, then called a meeting with the company's legal team and senior executives. What happened in that meeting would set the pattern for how the air conditioning industry would handle the dream research for the next 30 years. The company didn't try to suppress the research directly. That would have been too obvious, too likely to backfire. Instead, they developed a more subtle strategy. They would work to ensure that the research remained marginalized, confined to obscure academic journals, never breaking through into popular consciousness. They would promote alternative explanations for any dream phenomena that did receive attention, emphasizing individual psychology rather than environmental factors, and most importantly, they would fund their own research that emphasized the health benefits of air conditioning while carefully avoiding any investigation into dream effects. The strategy was implemented with remarkable efficiency. Carrier Corporation established a medical advisory board, staffed with respectable physicians and researchers who would provide scientific credibility to the company's health claims. The board was tasked with studying the effects of air conditioning on various health outcomes: respiratory disease, heat exhaustion, worker productivity, patient recovery times in hospitals. These were all legitimate areas of inquiry, and the research the board conducted was generally sound. But there was one area they were explicitly instructed never to investigate: dreams and sleep quality. The omission was intentional and carefully maintained. At the same time, the company's publicity department began placing stories in newspapers and magazines about the wonderful benefits of air conditioning. These stories emphasized comfort, health, productivity, and modernity. They featured testimonials from satisfied customers, statistics about improved worker efficiency, endorsements from medical professionals. The stories were ubiquitous through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, appearing in publications across the country, shaping public perception of air conditioning as an unalloyed good, a technology with no downsides or complications. When Dr. Ashford's research was finally published in 1929, it appeared in a specialized academic journal with limited circulation. The findings were striking. Clear documentation of altered dream patterns among people sleeping in cooled environments, with detailed analysis of the recurring ice imagery and the Ice King phenomenon. It should have been a significant story, the kind of finding that would have generated newspaper coverage and public discussion. But somehow it didn't break through. The major newspapers didn't pick it up. The popular magazines ignored it. It remained confined to academic circles, discussed among researchers but invisible to the broader public. This wasn't entirely accidental. The Carrier Corporation's publicity department had cultivated relationships with editors and journalists at major publications. They advertised heavily in newspapers and magazines, which gave them influence over editorial decisions. When Ashford's research was published, the company quietly reached out to their media contacts, suggesting that the story wasn't newsworthy, that it was preliminary research requiring further validation, that publicizing it might needlessly alarm the public about a technology that was genuinely beneficial. Most editors agreed. After all, Carrier was a major advertiser, and the research was admittedly strange and difficult to explain. Why complicate a good story about technological progress with weird reports about dreams? There were a few journalists who wanted to pursue the story anyway. One of them was Margaret Lindstrom, a science writer for a major syndicated news service. She'd read Ashford's paper and found it fascinating, a perfect example of the unexpected consequences of new technology. She interviewed Ashford, collected testimonials from people who'd experienced the ice dreams, and wrote a comprehensive article about the phenomenon. The article was scheduled to run in newspapers across the country in the spring of 1930, but it never appeared. The syndicate killed the story at the last minute, citing concerns about the scientific credibility of the research. Years later, after she'd retired, Lindstrom would tell colleagues that she suspected the syndicate had been pressured by Carrier Corporation, though she could never prove it. All she knew was that her editor, who'd initially been enthusiastic about the story, suddenly became dismissive, calling the research fringe science and not suitable for a general audience. Her article was spiked, and when she tried to place it elsewhere, she found that other publications were similarly uninterested. The story died before it could reach the public, This pattern repeated itself throughout the 1930s. Research into the psychological effects of air conditioning continued, conducted by various academic researchers working independently. Some of the findings were published in medical and psychological journals, but none of it broke through into popular consciousness. The air conditioning industry, led by Carrier but including other manufacturers, maintained a careful watch over public discourse about their products, using a combination of advertising pressure, media relationships, and strategic funding of favorable research to ensure that the narrative remained positive. The strategy was remarkably effective. By the mid-1930s, air conditioning was being installed in movie theaters, department stores, office buildings, and increasingly in private homes, at least among the wealthy. Millions of Americans were experiencing cooled environments regularly, and presumably many of them were having the ice dreams that researchers had documented. But there was no public awareness of the phenomenon, no discussion of it in popular media, no sense that air conditioning might have any effects beyond the obvious ones of comfort and temperature control. The industry's suppression efforts extended beyond simply keeping research out of newspapers. They also worked to influence the researchers themselves, offering funding for studies that focused on approved topics while making it clear that investigations into dream effects would receive no support. This was done subtly, through the normal mechanisms of research funding. A scientist applying for a grant to study how air conditioning affected respiratory health might receive generous funding. A scientist applying to study how it affected dreams would find their proposal rejected, not explicitly because of the topic but because of vague concerns about methodology or significance. Dr. Harrison Pembroke experienced this directly in 1932. He'd been working on sleep research for years, documenting the ice dreams and trying to understand their mechanisms. He applied for a major research grant from a foundation that had been established with money from air conditioning manufacturers. Though this connection wasn't immediately obvious, his proposal was detailed and methodologically sound, requesting funds for a comprehensive study of sleep patterns in various thermal environments. The foundation rejected it, but invited him to resubmit with a different focus. Perhaps he'd be interested in studying how air conditioning affected recovery times for surgical patients, or how it improved work performance in office environments. Anything but dreams. Pembroke understood what was happening. He wrote to Ashford, "They're trying to bury this, not through direct censorship, but by making it impossible to conduct proper research, by ensuring that anyone who wants to study the phenomenon has to do so without funding, on their own time, publishing in obscure journals that nobody reads. It's insidious because it doesn't look like suppression. It just looks like normal academic priority setting, normal funding decisions. But the effect is the same. The research doesn't get done, or if it gets done, nobody hears about it." The industry's efforts intensified during World War II and the post-war boom years. Air conditioning became increasingly affordable and widespread, no longer a luxury but an expected feature of modern life. The companies manufacturing cooling systems were making enormous profits and expanding rapidly. The last thing they wanted was a public discussion about psychological side effects, about altered dream states, about the Ice King phenomenon that by this point was being experienced by millions of people who had no idea it was connected to their sleeping environment. In 1947, a psychologist named Dr. Robert Cranston attempted to publish a popular book about the ice dreams. He'd been studying the phenomenon for 15 years, had collected hundreds of dream reports, had developed elaborate theories about what was happening and why. His manuscript was well written, accessible to general readers, and scientifically credible. It should have been published easily. Instead, it spent 2 years bouncing from publisher to publisher, each one initially expressing interest and then ultimately declining. Several editors told Cranston, off the record, that they'd been advised by their legal departments that the book could expose them to lawsuits from air conditioning manufacturers. The book was never published. Cranston's manuscript still exists in an archive at his university, a testament to research that was too inconvenient to see the light of day. The industry also promoted alternative explanations for any dream phenomena that did receive attention. When people mentioned having unusual dreams after installing air conditioning, the standard response from the industry was to suggest that the dreams were caused by improved sleep quality. When you sleep better, you remember more of your dreams, the industry's spokespeople would say. What you're experiencing is simply better dream recall due to more restful sleep. This explanation was plausible enough that most people accepted it without digging deeper. It shifted attention away from the content of the dreams, the consistent ice imagery, the recurring figures, and onto the more benign question of sleep quality. The industry also emphasized the health benefits of air conditioning so aggressively that any concerns about dreams seemed trivial by comparison. They promoted research showing reduced mortality during heat waves in air-conditioned buildings, improved outcomes for hospital patients, reduced respiratory disease in certain populations. All of this research was legitimate and important, but it was also strategically deployed to create a narrative in which air conditioning was an unqualified medical advance, a technology that saved lives and improved health. In this context, worries about altered dream states seemed frivolous, neurotic, the concerns of people who were resistant to progress. By the 1950s, the industry's strategy had succeeded completely. Air conditioning was ubiquitous in American public life and increasingly common in private homes. Millions of people were sleeping in cooled environments, experiencing altered dream patterns, encountering the Ice King in their nighttime visions. But there was virtually no public awareness of the phenomenon. No discussion of it in popular media, no sense that air conditioning might have any effects on consciousness beyond the immediate physical comfort it provided. The research community hadn't given up entirely. Small studies continued to be published in obscure journals. Researchers like Ashford and Pembroke, now elderly, continued documenting cases and trying to understand the mechanisms involved. But they were working in isolation, without significant funding, publishing for tiny audiences of fellow specialists. Their work had no impact on public understanding or policy. The air conditioning industry had successfully marginalized an entire field of inquiry, not through crude censorship, but through the subtle manipulation of funding, media coverage, and public discourse. There were occasional leaks, moments when the suppression strategy nearly failed. In 1952, a journalist named Howard Bennett got hold of some internal memos from the Carrier Corporation's publicity department, memos that explicitly discussed strategies for keeping dream research out of public view. Bennett wrote an expose for a major magazine, documenting how the industry had worked to suppress research and manipulate media coverage. The article was set to run as a cover story. Then, mysteriously, it was killed at the last minute. The magazine's publisher explained that the story couldn't be adequately verified, that it relied too heavily on documents that might have been forged or taken out of context. Bennett protested vigorously but got nowhere. Years later, he would discover that the magazine had been negotiating a major advertising contract with several air conditioning manufacturers at the time his story was killed. The timing, he believed, was not coincidental. What makes this history particularly troubling is how effective the suppression was. The air conditioning industry didn't just prevent public awareness of the dream research in their own time. They ensured that the research remained obscure for decades, that successive generations of scientists and journalists didn't even know it existed, didn't know there was anything to investigate. By the time academic historians and researchers began examining the history of air conditioning in the 1980s and 1990s, the dream research had been so thoroughly buried that most scholars didn't encounter it at all. It existed only in forgotten journals, and unpublished manuscripts. In private correspondence between researchers who'd been marginalized by the mainstream scientific community, the industry's suppression efforts were finally exposed in the early 2000s when a historian named Dr. Jennifer Blackwell was researching the history of sleep science and stumbled across references to the ice dream research in Ashford's archive papers. Intrigued, she began digging deeper, uncovering the network of suppressed studies, killed articles, unfunded proposals, and industry memos documenting deliberate strategies to keep the research out of public view. Her book, published in 2006, created a small stir in academic circles, but still didn't break through into popular consciousness. The story was too old, too complicated, too distant from contemporary concerns. Air conditioning had been ubiquitous for so long that nobody could imagine life without it. The fact that the industry had suppressed research about psychological effects 60 years earlier seemed like a historical curiosity, not something that mattered in the present day. But it did matter, because the suppression had worked so well that even today, most people who sleep in air-conditioned rooms and experience ice dreams have no idea that millions of others are having the same experiences, that there's a documented phenomenon with a long history, that the dreams aren't just random products of their individual psyches, but responses to specific environmental conditions. They wake from these dreams feeling strange and unsettled, not knowing that what they experienced has been experienced by countless others, that researchers once tried to study and understand it, that an entire field of inquiry was deliberately buried to protect corporate profits and maintain a simple narrative about technological progress. The marketing machine succeeded in its goal. Air conditioning became one of the defining technologies of the 20th century, reshaping where people lived and how they lived, making the American Sun Belt habitable, changing architecture and urban planning, transforming comfort from a luxury to an expectation. And the dreams that came with it, the Ice King and his frozen realm, were simply accepted as part of the landscape of modern consciousness, unexplained and unremarked, a side effect of progress that we all learned to live with without ever quite understanding what we'd traded for our constant, comfortable, unchanging indoor climate. The human body is not designed for constancy. Every system within us, from the molecular level up through cells and organs and complex regulatory networks, evolved to function in environments that change, that cycle, that fluctuate according to predictable rhythms, aligned with the rotation of the Earth and its orbit around the Sun. We are creatures of variation, of ebb and flow, of rising and falling tides within our own biology. When we remove that variation, when we impose artificial stability on systems that expect change, the consequences ripple through our physiology in ways we're only beginning to understand, ways that challenge our assumptions about what it means to be healthy, to sleep well, to function optimally as human beings. At the center of this story is a tiny cluster of cells in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock that coordinates circadian rhythms throughout the body. These 20,000 neurons, sitting just above where the optic nerves cross, receive information about light from the eyes, and use that information to synchronize hundreds of subsidiary clocks in tissues throughout the body. But light isn't the only signal these systems use. Temperature is equally important, perhaps more important in some ways, because temperature cycles have been a reliable feature of Earth's environment for far longer than humans or even mammals have existed. Long before eyes evolved to detect light, primitive organisms were using temperature fluctuations to organize their internal processes, to know when to be active and when to rest, to coordinate their biology with the physical reality of living on a rotating planet. Our circadian system still relies heavily on temperature cues, though we've largely forgotten this in our temperature-controlled modern world. The suprachiasmatic nucleus receives temperature information from sensors throughout the body, particularly from the periphery, the hands, feet, face, areas where temperature changes are most readily detected. Under natural conditions, these sensors report a consistent pattern: warmth during the day, cooling in the evening, coldest temperatures in the hours before dawn, warming again with sunrise. This pattern is so reliable, so ancient, that our internal clocks use it as a primary reference point, as important as light for maintaining proper circadian alignment. When you sleep in a naturally ventilated environment, your body experiences this temperature cycle intimately. As evening approaches and the air begins to cool, your peripheral temperature sensors report the change to your brain. The suprachiasmatic nucleus interprets this cooling as a signal that night is approaching, that it's time to initiate the cascade of changes that prepare you for sleep. The pineal gland increases melatonin production. Your core body temperature begins its nightly descent. Your blood pressure drops. Your metabolism slows. These changes don't happen because you've decided to sleep. They happen because your circadian system has received reliable environmental information indicating that night has arrived, and it's orchestrating your physiology accordingly. But in an air-conditioned room set to maintain constant temperature, these signals become confused or absent entirely. The peripheral sensors report the same temperature hour after hour. The suprachiasmatic nucleus receives no clear information about time of day from temperature cues. It must rely more heavily on light. But even that signal is often compromised in modern environments where we use artificial light extensively in the evening and shield ourselves from natural light during the day with indoor living. The result is a circadian system operating with degraded information, like trying to navigate with a compass that doesn't quite point north, that wavers and drifts, never giving you absolute confidence in which direction you're heading. The effects of this circadian disruption are subtle at first, but profound over time. Melatonin production, which should follow a smooth curve rising in the evening and falling toward morning, becomes erratic. Studies comparing melatonin levels in people sleeping in temperature-controlled versus naturally varying environments have found significant differences in both the timing and amplitude of melatonin release. In naturally varying environments, melatonin rises sharply as temperature falls in the evening, reaches a clear peak in the coldest part of the night, then declines as temperature rises toward dawn. The signal is crisp, unambiguous, perfectly synchronized with the external environment. In constant temperature environments, the melatonin curve becomes flattened, less distinct. It still rises and falls, but the peaks are lower, the timing more variable, the overall pattern less robust. This matters because melatonin isn't just a sleep signal. It's a master regulator of circadian rhythms throughout the body, influencing everything from immune function to metabolism to cellular repair processes. When melatonin signaling becomes degraded, all of these downstream processes become less precisely timed, less efficiently coordinated. You're not sick exactly. You're just operating at slightly reduced efficiency across multiple systems simultaneously. The impact on sleep architecture itself is even more striking. Remember that sleep isn't a single uniform state, but a complex cycling through different stages, each with its own characteristics and functions. In natural conditions, with temperature falling through the night, these stages follow a predictable progression. You descend through increasingly deep non-REM sleep stages in the first part of the night, when cooling is most rapid. Then, in the coldest hours before dawn, you spend extended periods in REM sleep, the stage associated with vivid dreaming and memory consolidation. This architecture has been shaped by millions of years of evolution to align with natural temperature patterns, to take advantage of the specific physiological states that different temperature ranges produce. But constant temperature disrupts this architecture in multiple ways. First, without the temperature cues that normally help orchestrate transitions between sleep stages, the cycling becomes less regular. You might enter REM sleep earlier or later than you would naturally, spend more or less time in specific stages unpredictably. Sleep researchers have documented this using polysomnography, the detailed recording of brain waves, eye movements, and muscle activity during sleep. When they compare sleep architecture and temperature, controlled versus naturally varying environments, they see clear differences in stage sequencing, duration, and depth. More specifically, constant cool temperatures appear to artificially extend REM sleep periods and increase their intensity. This happens because cool temperature is one of the natural triggers for REM sleep. Your body associates coolness with the pre-dawn hours when REM should be most prominent. When the temperature stays cool all night, your body keeps receiving signals that it's time for REM sleep, leading to longer, more intense REM periods than would occur naturally. This might sound beneficial. More REM sleep should be good, right? But the relationship between sleep stages isn't simply additive. You can't just maximize one stage and expect better overall sleep. The stages need to be balanced, properly sequenced, integrated into a coherent nightly rhythm. Excessive or poorly timed REM sleep can actually impair some of the restorative functions of sleep. Deep non-REM sleep, which occurs primarily in the first half of the night, is crucial for physical repair, immune function, and clearing metabolic waste from the brain. If REM sleep encroaches on this early period, if the balance between sleep stages shifts, you might get less of this essential deep sleep, even while getting more total REM sleep. The result is sleep that feels subjectively less restorative, despite objectively containing more of the stage we associate with dreaming and memory processing. This imbalance helps explain why people who sleep in air-conditioned rooms often report feeling unrested despite sleeping through the night. Despite having no obvious sleep disorders, their sleep architecture has been subtly warped by the constant temperature, shifted away from the natural pattern that their bodies evolved to require. They're sleeping, but they're not sleeping in the way their biology expects, and the accumulating deficit manifests as vague fatigue, reduced cognitive performance, mood disturbances that can't be traced to any single obvious cause. The dream effects we've discussed in earlier sections, the ice dreams, the Ice King phenomenon, can be understood in this context as symptoms of disrupted sleep architecture. The extended, intensified REM periods produced by constant cool temperatures create conditions for unusually vivid and memorable dreams. The confusion in the circadian system about time of day and seasonal position may contribute to the specific content of these dreams. The persistent imagery of cold and winter and frozen timelessness. The dreams are both a symptom of the biological disruption and a window into it, a way the sleeping mind signals that something isn't quite right about its environment. The seasonal effects are even more profound, though harder to study because they unfold over months rather than single nights. In natural conditions, your sleep patterns would shift significantly between summer and winter. In winter, with longer nights and colder temperatures, you'd sleep more overall, spend more time in deep sleep, have different dream patterns. Your metabolism would shift, your immune system would adjust. Your hormone production would follow seasonal rhythms that prepared your body for the specific challenges of cold weather. In summer, you'd sleep less, more lightly, with different hormonal and metabolic profiles appropriate for the active season. These seasonal adjustments aren't optional extras that we can discard without consequence. They're deeply integrated into human physiology, connected to everything from fertility cycles to immune function to mood regulation. When you live in a temperature-controlled environment year-round, these seasonal rhythms become attenuated or disappear entirely. Your body receives no clear information about which season it's experiencing, so it can't make the appropriate adjustments. You end up in a kind of perpetual spring or fall, never quite in the deep rest of winter or the high activity of summer. Stuck in a middle state that might seem comfortable, but that doesn't allow for the full range of physiological variation your body is designed to express. Research into seasonal affective disorder has revealed that many people need strong seasonal signals to maintain proper mood regulation. Without the clear light and temperature cues that mark the changing seasons, they develop depression, particularly in winter, when the disconnect between the amount of light and warmth they experience indoors and what their bodies expect becomes most pronounced. But seasonal affective disorder may be just the most visible manifestation of a broader phenomenon affecting everyone who lives in constant temperature environments, a chronic low-level desynchronization between internal biological rhythms and the external reality we've created for ourselves. The metabolic consequences are particularly striking. Your metabolic rate naturally varies through the day and across seasons, rising during active periods and falling during rest, higher in summer than winter. This variation is healthy, allowing your body to conserve energy when it's appropriate and expend it freely when it's needed. But constant temperature environments tend to flatten metabolic rhythms. Your body doesn't need to work to maintain warmth, doesn't need to adjust to changing external conditions, so it settles into a narrow range of metabolic activity that may be less efficient overall than the wider natural variation. Some researchers believe this metabolic flattening contributes to the obesity epidemic in developed countries. When you're never exposed to cold, when you never need to generate heat internally, you don't activate brown fat, the specialized tissue that burns calories to produce warmth. Brown fat activity is highest in winter, or would be if we experienced real winter cold, rather than living in heated indoor spaces. Without this seasonal activation of brown fat, without the metabolic challenges that cold exposure provides, our overall energy expenditure decreases. We eat the same amount or more, but we burn less, and the difference accumulates as excess body fat. The immune system shows similar temperature-dependent rhythms that become disrupted in constant temperature environments. Immune function naturally varies with circadian rhythms and seasonal cycles, strongest in the evening and during winter months when infectious disease risk is typically highest. But this variation depends on clear temperature signals. When those signals are absent or contradictory, immune rhythms become less pronounced, less responsive. You might not get sick more often in an absolute sense, but your immune system is operating with less precision, less temporal coordination, which may contribute to the chronic low-level inflammation that underlies many modern diseases. Even cellular repair processes show circadian and temperature dependence. DNA repair, protein synthesis, cellular cleanup mechanisms, all of these follow daily rhythms coordinated by the circadian clock and modulated by temperature. In constant temperature environments, these rhythms persist but with reduced amplitude, less precise timing. Over years and decades, this might contribute to accelerated aging, increased cancer risk, degenerative diseases that emerge from the accumulation of inadequately repaired cellular damage. What makes all of this particularly challenging is that the effects are subtle and delayed. You don't feel dramatically worse after one night in an air-conditioned room. You might not notice any difference after a month or a year. But over years and decades, the cumulative effects of chronic circadian disruption, flattened physiological rhythms, and altered sleep architecture add up. You might age faster, develop diseases earlier, experience cognitive decline sooner than you would if you'd maintained stronger circadian rhythms through more natural temperature exposure. Recent research has begun exploring whether we can mitigate these effects by reintroducing temperature variation even within controlled environments. Some sleep researchers recommend programming thermostats to drop temperature through the night, mimicking natural cooling patterns. Early results suggest this can improve sleep architecture, strengthen circadian rhythms, and reduce some of the negative effects of constant temperature, but it's a partial solution at best, because it only addresses nighttime temperature, while we spend most of our waking hours in temperature-controlled environments as well. The deeper issue is that we've created a civilization-wide experiment in removing temperature variation from human life, and we're only beginning to understand the full consequences. We gained comfort and productivity, the ability to live and work in climates that would otherwise be uninhabitable or extremely challenging. But we traded away something our bodies need: the variation, the cycling, the rhythmic change that our physiology evolved to expect and depend upon. We're discovering that human health isn't just about avoiding extremes, about staying comfortable. It's about experiencing the full range of environmental variation that our biology is designed to handle, that our circadian systems use as information, that our sleep architecture requires to function optimally every night. When you go to sleep in your temperature-controlled bedroom, your body tries to do what it evolved to do: synchronize with your environment, use temperature cues to coordinate complex physiological processes, cycle through sleep stages in patterns aligned with the cooling and warming of the night. But the environment you've created doesn't provide the signals it expects. The temperature stays constant. Your circadian system struggles to maintain proper timing without the information it needs. Your sleep architecture warps into unnatural patterns. Your dreams fill with ice and frozen landscapes, symbols generated by a confused biology trying to make sense of thermal signals that don't match anything in the evolutionary history of your species. And you wake feeling vaguely unrested, slightly disconnected, chronically fatigued in ways you can't quite explain, paying a price for comfort that compounds night after night, year after year, a biological trade, off we made without fully understanding what we were trading away. The rediscovery began quietly, as these things often do, in a sleep laboratory at Stanford University in 2003. A graduate student named Maya Patel was conducting routine polysomnography studies, measuring brain waves and sleep patterns in volunteers, when she noticed something odd in her data. Subjects who slept in rooms cooled to a constant 65 degrees showed unusual sleep architecture compared to historical norms. Their REM periods were longer, more intense, occurring at unexpected times in the sleep cycle. When she mentioned this to her advisor, he dismissed it as experimental noise, individual variation, nothing significant. But Patel was meticulous, and she kept noticing the pattern. She began asking her subjects about their dreams. What she heard surprised her. Nearly all of them reported vivid dreams involving cold, ice, winter landscapes. Some described frozen palaces or crystalline structures. Several mentioned a figure they variously called a king or emperor or sovereign, always associated with ice and isolation. Patel had never heard of the Ice King phenomenon. She knew nothing about the research conducted by Ashford and Pembroke 80 years earlier. She was simply observing what her subjects told her and noting the remarkable consistency in their reports. She began to suspect she'd stumbled onto something real, something that deserved investigation beyond her original research protocol. But when she proposed expanding her study to focus on temperature effects and dream content, she encountered resistance. Her advisor was skeptical. The department was focused on more mainstream sleep research, sleep apnea, insomnia, narcolepsy, disorders with clear clinical relevance. Dreams were considered too subjective, too difficult to study rigorously. And the idea that room temperature could produce specific dream content seemed far-fetched, too reminiscent of the kind of fringe theories that gave sleep research a bad reputation in earlier decades. Patel persisted, working on the project in her spare time, collecting dream reports from volunteers, documenting patterns. She knew she was onto something, even if she couldn't yet prove it or explain it. The breakthrough came in 2006, when she discovered Jennifer Blackwell's book about the history of suppressed dream research. Reading it was a revelation. Everything Patel had been observing independently had been documented decades earlier, studied extensively, then deliberately buried by industry pressure. She wasn't discovering something new. She was rediscovering something that had been known and then forgotten, that had been pushed out of scientific discourse and was only now resurfacing. She contacted Blackwell, and together they began reaching out to other sleep researchers, asking if anyone else had noticed temperature-related dream effects in their data. They found more than they expected. Multiple research groups had observed similar patterns, but had dismissed them as anomalies or hadn't pursued them due to lack of funding or institutional support. A team in Germany had documented altered REM sleep patterns in temperature-controlled environments. Researchers in Japan had collected dream reports showing the same ice imagery and recurring figures. A group in Australia had been studying circadian disruption from constant temperature and had noticed dream effects but hadn't published about them. Slowly, a network of researchers began to coalesce, united by the realization that they were all observing pieces of the same phenomenon, that something important had been overlooked or suppressed for decades and was now demanding attention. By 2008, this informal network had formalized into what they called the Thermal Sleep Research Consortium, an international collaboration dedicated to understanding how temperature affects sleep and consciousness. They designed coordinated studies, shared data, published jointly. The research they produced over the next decade would transform our understanding of sleep and finally vindicate the early researchers whose work had been marginalized. What they found was both more complex and more profound than anyone had anticipated. First, they confirmed beyond any doubt that constant cool temperature produces specific and predictable alterations in sleep architecture. Using modern imaging technology, fMRI and PET scans that could show brain activity during sleep, they could see exactly what was happening. In constant cool environments, the brain regions associated with thermoregulation remained more active during REM sleep than they should be, essentially staying on high alert, monitoring for temperature changes that never came. This sustained activation bled into other systems, affecting dream generation, memory consolidation, emotional processing. The brain was trying to sleep normally while simultaneously dealing with an environmental anomaly, and the result was a kind of cognitive dissonance that manifested in altered dream content and disrupted circadian rhythms. Second, they discovered that the effects were dose-dependent and cumulative. One night in an air-conditioned room produced minimal effects. A week produced measurable changes in sleep architecture. Months or years of constant temperature exposure produced profound alterations in circadian rhythms, melatonin production, and dream patterns. Most remarkably, they found that these changes could persist even after people stopped sleeping in temperature-controlled environments. It took weeks or even months of sleeping in naturally varying temperatures before circadian rhythms normalized and sleep architecture returned to baseline patterns. The body adapted to constant temperature, but that adaptation itself became a problem that had to be reversed. Third, they finally explained the Ice King phenomenon. Using a combination of dream content analysis, brain imaging, and thermal physiology studies, they showed that the recurring imagery wasn't random or purely psychological. It was the brain's attempt to create narrative coherence out of contradictory thermal signals. The constant cool temperature was interpreted by ancient thermoregulatory systems as perpetual winter, as the coldest part of the night extending indefinitely. But other systems, those tracking actual time, those responding to light cues, knew it wasn't really continuous winter or endless night. The resulting conflict between different sources of environmental information created a kind of cognitive dissonance that the dreaming mind resolved through symbolic imagery. A frozen realm, a winter that never ends, a king trapped in ice, powerful but immobilized, sovereign but imprisoned. The Ice King, they propose, was a metaphor generated by the unconscious mind to represent the sleeper's own situation, comfortable but constrained, protected but disconnected from natural rhythms, existing in an artificial environment that was simultaneously beneficial and limiting. The consistency of the imagery across different cultures and individuals reflected the universality of human thermoregulation. The fact that all human nervous systems process temperature information in fundamentally similar ways. When presented with the same anomalous thermal environment, different brains independently generated similar symbolic resolutions. This interpretation was both elegant and testable. The researchers predicted that changes in the specifics of thermal environment should produce corresponding changes in dream content. They tested this by having subjects sleep in rooms with different temperature patterns: constant cool, constant warm, cycling from cool to warm, cycling from warm to cool. Each pattern produced distinct dream content. Constant warm produced dreams of deserts and drought and burning suns. Cycling temperatures produced dreams with narrative arcs that matched the thermal cycle, dreams that began in one environment and progressed to another. The correlation was striking and highly statistically significant. Perhaps most importantly, the consortium's research revealed serious health implications that went far beyond interesting dream effects. They documented cardiovascular changes, metabolic disruptions, immune dysfunction, accelerated aging markers, all associated with long-term exposure to constant temperature environments. This wasn't just about weird dreams. It was about fundamental physiological processes being chronically disrupted by the mismatch between our evolutionary heritage and our modern built environment. A 2015 study led by Dr. James Chen compared health outcomes in populations living in naturally ventilated versus climate-controlled housing. The results were sobering. After controlling for socioeconomic factors, diet, exercise, and other confounds, people living in constant temperature environments showed higher rates of metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and neurodegenerative conditions. The effect sizes were small but significant, perhaps a 10 to 15% increased risk across various conditions. Multiplied across entire populations, this represented millions of excess cases of disease potentially attributable to our thermal environment. The pharmaceutical industry took notice when research showed that constant temperature affected drug metabolism and chronotherapy, the practice of timing medication to circadian rhythms. Drugs that worked well, when dosed according to natural circadian patterns, were less effective in people with flattened rhythms from constant temperature exposure. The implications for drug development and clinical practice were enormous. Medicine had been assuming that circadian rhythms were relatively robust across modern populations, but the research revealed significant variation based on thermal environment that could affect treatment outcomes. By 2018, the accumulated evidence was substantial enough that public health organizations began issuing recommendations. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine published guidelines suggesting that bedrooms should not maintain constant temperature through the night, that programmable thermostats should be set to gradually decrease temperature through the sleep period and increase toward waking time, mimicking natural patterns. The World Health Organization issued similar recommendations, noting that thermal variation was an underappreciated factor in sleep health and circadian rhythm maintenance. But changing entire populations, sleeping environments was another matter. The air conditioning industry, far more powerful and entrenched than it had been in the 1920s, initially resisted these recommendations. They funded their own studies, challenged the methodology of the thermal sleep research, emphasized the life-saving benefits of air conditioning in extreme heat. The debate played out in scientific journals and media coverage throughout the late 2010s, with sleep researchers on one side and industry-funded scientists on the other, arguing about effect sizes, causation versus correlation. The practical feasibility of implementing temperature variation in modern housing. A turning point came in 2019, when a major longitudinal study tracking 50,000 subjects over 20 years showed unambiguously that sleep in naturally varying temperature environments was associated with better health outcomes across multiple domains: cognitive function, cardiovascular health, metabolic health, longevity. The study was too large, too well designed to dismiss, Even industry-funded critics couldn't find significant methodological flaws. The evidence had become overwhelming. Constant temperature environments, while comfortable, were not optimal for human health. This realization sparked innovation in sleep technology. Companies began developing smart, climate control systems that could mimic natural temperature variation throughout the night. These systems used sophisticated algorithms based on circadian science, gradually cooling the bedroom as you fell asleep, maintaining lower temperatures through the middle of the night, then warming gently toward morning to facilitate natural waking. Early adopters reported dramatic improvements in sleep quality, better dream recall, more refreshing sleep, and notably, a decrease in ice dreams. When the thermal environment provided proper variation, the Ice King retreated, appearing less frequently or not at all. Other innovations followed. Mattresses with temperature, regulating zones, blankets with programmable warming and cooling, even sleepwear designed to facilitate natural thermoregulation. The sleep optimization industry, already substantial, pivoted to incorporate thermal variation as a central principle. What had been a marginal concern, room temperature as a factor in sleep quality, moved to the center of both scientific and commercial attention. Educational institutions began teaching about thermal sleep health. Medical schools added it to their curriculum. Public health campaigns educated people about the importance of temperature variation for healthy sleep. Slowly, cultural attitudes began to shift. The idea that you should maintain your bedroom at a constant, comfortable temperature all night began to seem outdated, even harmful. People started opening windows at night even in summer, using fans to create air movement and temperature variation, embracing some degree of thermal challenge rather than seeking perfect constancy. The dream research took on new significance in this context. Researchers realized that dreams weren't just symptoms of disrupted sleep, they were potentially diagnostic tools. The content and quality of dreams could provide information about circadian health, thermal environment, sleep architecture. People were encouraged to keep dream journals, not for psychological interpretation, but as health monitoring. Persistent ice dreams might indicate that your bedroom was too constantly cool, that you needed more temperature variation. Dreams of heat and drought might suggest the opposite problem. The dreams became a form of biofeedback. Your brain telling you something important about your sleeping environment. Some researchers went further, proposing that we should be deliberately optimizing our thermal environments, not just for sleep quantity or even quality, but specifically for dream health. They argued that dreams served important psychological and cognitive functions, emotional regulation, memory consolidation, creative problem solving, and that these functions were impaired by the altered dream patterns produced by constant temperature. Optimizing dreams meant optimizing thermal environment, and doing so could improve mental health, cognitive performance, even creativity and problem-solving ability. A fascinating 2022 study tested this by having subjects solve complex problems before sleep, then tracking both their sleeping temperature environment and their dreams. Subjects who slept in naturally varying temperatures were significantly more likely to have dreams that incorporated the problems they'd been working on, and to wake with insights or solutions. Subjects in constant temperature environments dreamed differently, often the ice dreams, and were less likely to make problem-solving progress during sleep. The research suggested that proper thermal environment was necessary for the cognitive functions of dreaming to operate optimally. By the mid-2020s, the modern awakening to thermal sleep science had reached mainstream consciousness. Popular books about sleep optimization inevitably included chapters on temperature. Fitness influencers and biohackers experimented with extreme thermal protocols, cold plunges before bed, sleeping outdoors, deliberately austere sleeping environments meant to maximize temperature variation. Some of this was scientifically informed, some was pseudoscientific excess, but it all reflected a broader recognition that temperature mattered. that our grandparents might have been sleeping more healthily than we were despite lacking all our modern knowledge and technology. The architectural profession took notice. New building codes in some jurisdictions began requiring that residential bedrooms be designable for natural ventilation, not solely dependent on mechanical climate control. Architects started designing homes with thermal mass that would naturally cool overnight and warm during the day, reducing dependence on constant mechanical cooling. It was a small movement back toward buildings that worked with natural thermal rhythms rather than fighting against them constantly. Perhaps most profoundly, the research prompted a broader rethinking of our relationship with environmental variation. We'd spent a century building a civilization that tried to eliminate variation, to provide constant comfort independent of external conditions. This project had been wildly successful by its own metrics. We'd achieved unprecedented control over our immediate environment. But we were discovering that constancy itself was a problem, that our bodies needed variation to function properly, that comfort and health weren't synonymous, that sometimes the optimal environment was one that challenged us, that changed, that asked our biology to do the work it evolved to do. The Ice King, in this new understanding, became a powerful symbol of what we'd lost and what we were trying to recover. He represented the price of comfort, the isolation that comes from disconnection from natural rhythms, the frozen potential of bodies and minds adapted to variation, but living in constancy. As people started sleeping in more naturally variable temperatures, many reported that the Ice King began to change in their dreams. He started moving, speaking, even thawing. Some dreamers reported that he left his throne, walked out of his frozen palace, and disappeared into landscapes that began warming and blooming. It was as if the collective unconscious was responding to changes in the physical world, as if the symbol was adapting as the reality it represented began to shift. Not everyone made these changes. Air conditioning remained ubiquitous, and many people preferred constant comfort to optimal health, especially as the planet warmed and heat waves became more severe and frequent. But a significant minority began experimenting with thermal variation, began sleeping with windows open and thermostats programmed to cycle, began paying attention to their dreams as feedback about their sleeping environment. They reported better sleep, better health, and most remarkably, a sense of reconnection with something essential they hadn't realized they'd lost. A feeling of being synchronized with natural rhythms, of their bodies working the way they were designed to work, of dreams that felt richer and more meaningful, because they emerged from sleep that was itself more aligned with millions of years of evolutionary heritage. The modern awakening to thermal sleep science represents one of those rare moments when science circles back to recover knowledge that was suppressed or forgotten, when researchers rediscover truths that earlier generations had glimpsed but couldn't fully articulate or preserve. We're learning that optimal sleep isn't just about duration or even about sleep stages in isolation. It's about the entire thermal, temporal, and environmental context in which sleep occurs. We're learning that our ancestors, sleeping in caves and simple shelters with naturally varying temperatures, might have had healthier sleep architecture than we do in our precisely climate-controlled bedrooms. And we're learning that the dreams we have, including those strange recurring visions of ice and frozen kings, are trying to tell us something important about the price we pay for divorcing ourselves from the natural rhythms that shaped our evolution and continue to shape our biology, whether we acknowledge them or not.